Good morning, good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a real privilege to have all of you here, and for me personally to step away from responding to notices to actually do some real work, and to welcome all of you to what is a really important culmination of 2 years or over 2 years of work, if we include a lot of preceding conversations that began on this project headed by, anchored in CPR State Capacity Initiative, titled Know Your Regulator. In more ways than one, this project, I think, holds all of what CPR is all about, in that it is a space where questions of the Indian state, how the Indian state is organized, how the Indian state operates, the transformation and transitions that the state has gone through as the economy has transformed and placed new and pressing challenges on the state, are all questions of deep interest and relevance to any kind of policy work, and is something that has animated a lot of research that colleagues at CPR have done over the decades. But in much of our work, where we've tried to understand India's state institutions, examine their capacity, articulate it, and try to examine and put forth policy recommendations on how to make these institutions more capable, more accountable, better governed, there has always been this big, in a sense, black hole of the regulatory institutions. These are institutions that have been at the core of the economic transformation that India has gone through. These are institutions that are at the core of what makes the fulcrum of the Indian state in a 21st century economy. And in fact, even in a 20th century economy, many regulatory institutions have played a significant role in making and shaping of the Indian state and of our engagement with the Indian state as citizens. Yet, in much of the discourse on public institutions and the Indian state, this is one arena that's short of the very, very important work that Devesh had anchored some years ago, which CPR also had the privilege of hosting its launch, and engaging in a dialogue on regulatory institutions. This is one area that remains relatively unexplored. But that lack of exploration is not just a matter of absence of research. It's also that these regulatory institutions, by definition, tend to be a few steps separated from direct citizen engagement and direct dialogue. And so when we began to think about how to engage with regulatory institutions, the idea that that engagement should not be restricted to a series of research outputs, but actually become part of a wider public conversation about the nature of regulatory institutions and their internal dynamics and their relationship with citizens, was at the core of how we chose to frame the Know Your Regulator series. And socializing these kinds of ideas and building research into dialogue with the public, and serving as a convening hub that brings institutions, institutional actors, citizens, stakeholders of all kinds into conversation, is the core of what CPR does and its mandate. Simultaneously, CPR has always traditionally been an institution that firmly believes in the importance of collaboration and collective participation in any of its research endeavors. And this effort also embodied precisely these modes of operation. The partnership began in 2021. At that point, Dr. KP Krishnan, who's now honorary professor at CPR, was at the National Council of Applied Economic Research, working on issues of regulation. And so we thought two institutions coming together to dialogue on this was an extremely important platform to create. And we were extremely honored that Dr. Sahoo, who at that time was chair of FOIA, along with Dr. Abha Yadav, joined hands in our initial foray into these dialogues and discussions, which we started in September 2021. And in fact, that the early dialogue is particularly etched in my mind because this was in the peak of the COVID phase and was perhaps one of the first hybrid in-person dialogues that we had. I used to come into CPR often, but it was lonely me with a few other colleagues. And thanks to FOIA and Know Your Regulator, we had a little bit of company for a few hours, which made a huge difference to all of our moods and to the core of the purpose of this series, which was to have a collective public dialogue. So I'm really honored that CPR was able to host these. We've had over 10 such dialogues in the course of this 1 year, 2 years, sorry. We've been able to partner with regulatory institutions. It has spurred a range of some really important research that the team has put out in the public domain, including the briefing note that anchors the discussion for today. This is also a flagship of the State Capacity Initiative, which is a very crucial and important initiative of CPR. I'm really grateful to all my colleagues, Dr. KP Krishnan, who is the intellectual anchor of this, Dr. Mekhala Krishnamurthy, who provided both intellectual support, practical support, and mobilized all of us and made the word socialization, socialized the word socialization into our lexicon, so we use it all the time. Dr. Arkaja Singh, who spearheaded a lot of the dialogue and is one of the key authors of the briefing report, and of course, Amrita, sitting to my right, who has been critical to putting all of this together. So thank you very much, all of you. It's a real honor, and I'm truly excited to see the culmination of these dialogues in today's conversation, and I'll hand over to Dr. KP Krishnan to take the conversation forward.
Thank you, Yamini. Good evening to all the people assembled here. Good morning, Devesh, and good morning to those who are in different time zones. I would like to join Yamini in thanking, starting with the thanks to Mr. Sahoo, who's been with us literally from the first day. In fact, a lot of these ideas were actually refined in my conversations with him. And as the then chairperson of the Forum of Indian Regulators, it was Mr. Sahoo who said we would be an important sort of partner in this. And I think it made a lot of difference. Thank you. Obviously, I would also like to add a solid word of thanks to I think he's a guru to a lot of us here. He would want to dissociate from many of us if we insist on calling him our guru. But guru, more than in one sense, Devesh, thanks. You've been a guru. Thanks for joining. And look forward to your sort of interesting and observations on aspects that we would not have thought of. I also want to thank Yamini and Mekhala, who've been very supportive and much before I formally joined CPR. It was, I think, in a sense, their generosity which enabled us to do this in a lot of different formats. Precisely, as Yamini said, during COVID, when it was difficult to get any kind of event going, to put together a hybrid event with support of a lot of people was, I think, entirely due only to Yamini and Mekhala. Thanks, both of you. Abha Yadav, now with Mr. Sahoo in NLUI, National Law University in Delhi, then of IICA and FOIA, and Arkaja did a lot of the heavy lifting. My thanks to both of them, and of course, my teammates, Amrita, Shamil, and Mugdha have been an important part of this work. The idea behind KYR, Know Your Regulator, was primarily to demystify an institutional construct which is now rather critical in the lives of most of us, the way it impacts society, economy, and the polity. SRAs, namely statutory regulatory authorities, are omnipresent, they are omnipotent, and I think what is worrisome is that they actually think they are omniscient. But in the first place, why are SRAs or statutory regulatory authorities important? I thought I'd start with this old, very well-known quotation of Winston Churchill, when he said in 1947 that many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. And if you are wondering what it has to do with SRAs, the simple truth is, like democracy, market economy, or many elements of the market economy like democracy are better than any other form of organizing our lives and organizing economic activity. And given that we are clearly headed in sort of the direction of more and more markets, a bulk of the public economic policy challenge is going to be achieving the difficult right balance between the role of markets and the role of state, or between correcting market failures through state intervention while being conscious of state failure. In this context, regulation generally and regulation through SRAs is potentially a very heavy-handed form of state intervention, in as much as it combines the powers of more than one organ of the state. And the sort of design in India has been a combination of all three organs of the state. So potentially not only very powerful, but inbuilt in that is not one, but three sub-state failures, and that can be a problem. I don't need to go very far. If we want to draw a recent example, you just need to look at some of the pleadings of the Reserve Bank of India in this famous judgment which came day before yesterday on declaring a loan as a fraud. The law officer of the union appearing for the Central Bank of India formally argued that a public sector bank, which is a commercial entity, exercising powers vested in the Banking Regulation Act, can, without giving a hearing, be allowed to declare a loan as a fraud, with the consequence that that borrower cannot borrow from any part of the Indian financial system. Now, anyone who has done the first lesson in the first year of administrative law will know that the minimum that is required before you visit somebody with such serious consequences, you have to give a hearing. And here is the law officer of India and the Central Bank of India quoting a 2016 circular arguing that audi alterum partem, or no one shall be condemned unheard, is not necessary, because before they take further action and when criminal action is initiated, the police in any case will come and talk to them. You actually need to go through the pleadings to understand the potential of this complete extinction of separation of powers and the potential loss of all kinds of liberties. And this is not to say that there are no non-performing assets in Indian banking, or that Indian banking needs to be done much better. None of those points is being disputed. But the short point is the regulator actually claiming that a commercial entity regulated by me will have the authority to exercise powers of law and declare a person as a fraud without giving him or her an opportunity of being heard. I think that, to me, is a quick summary of what we need to be worried about. The number of SRAs in India today is not countable in my two hands. It used to be when I started my career in Government of India, which is not when Alexander came to India. I may look much older to you, but 15 years ago, I could count the number of regulators in my hands. Now it is not. And the proliferation is going on. I won't list them. You will get to see them when you read the handbook. they touch us in innumerable ways. So I think it's important for us as citizens, forget academics, forget researchers, as citizens, on your sort of average day, from the time that you buy that kurkure to the medicine that you buy, the bus that you travel in, the metro that you catch, the swipe that you do with your card, the Uber that you use, every activity is regulated by a statutory regulatory authority. So this is what we need to understand. The idea here was, can we demystify them for intelligent, interested citizens, but in parallel, work on a serious research project of how to make them better. So in these 12 conversations that we've had with regulators, spanning finance, health and wellness, utilities, and real estate, spread over almost 16, 18 months, we've tried to understand both the perspectives. Clearly, unlike the law officer of India, we believe in audi alteram partem. We said there is a viewpoint which we need to understand, which is the viewpoint of the regulator. What is it that is holding back the regulator from doing what we think are essential, straightforward, good practices? Are there resource issues? Are there human resource capacity issues? Are there statutory limitations, etc., etc.? So the result was a conversation which is not necessarily pushing a point of view, which is looking at consumer or the citizen in the center, but trying to accommodate the viewpoints of various stakeholders. These conversations and the notes diligently put together by Arkaja and the entire team are all in the public domain. And I think they constitute enormously rich material for students, scholars, and practitioners. I expect that in the course of today's conversation, we'll have the opportunity to touch upon some of these aspects, but these are conversations which hopefully we will have as we go along. I'll conclude here and hand over the mic to Amrita to give us an overview of the state capacity initiatives work on regulation. Thank you.
We have a small presentation for today. We thought this is a good occasion to highlight, some key pieces of work on regulation. Since the beginning, the approach for this work program has been well charted. The State Capacity Initiative has sought to bring to the fore the value and purpose of statutory regulatory agencies, arm's length bodies, and also unpack and analyze the ways in which they function that are distinct from government departments. Apart from this work, we are also regular faculty at capacity building programs where a lot of these officials participate. And many of these have been conceived and, ideated by Abha, who unfortunately is not here yet, when she was the director of the Forum of Indian Regulators. So even these interactions and engagements have given direction to the work that we've undertaken at this program. Now, quickly turning to some of the work that we wanted to highlight for you today. Next slide, please. Regulatory design and capacity has been a central research theme in our work, and Know Your Regulator seminar series has been crucial to it. Dr. Krishnan has already taken us through the background to the series, so I won't dwell on it any longer. But I just want to reiterate that the focus of every conversation that we have had with regulatory chairpersons has been to understand its organization, its rules, and its people. Next slide, please. The valuable learnings from the KYR series have culminated in a research paper by one of our fellows, Arkaja Singh. It provides a nice sort of analytical framework to understand these arm's length agencies. There is also a wonderful line in the paper that we thought, captures the essence of the design of these bodies. And I'm just paraphrasing it now here, but it reads, she notes in the paper that regulation offer the opportunity to the upper levels of the bureaucracy, the elite Indian bureaucracy, to recast their power and shift focus to, things like economic rationality, independence, technical specialization. But she notes in the paper that that's possibly, not really happening in practice. And we still have we've set up these agencies that are, quite tied to their counterpart departments and are still led by retired bureaucrats. So Arkaja in this paper examines 5 agencies from the post liberalization era and draws on our, our in-depth conversations with regulatory chairpersons as well as part of our analysis. Next slide, please. We have also studied the federal deficit or the lack of representation of state interests in regulatory decision making. We view parliamentary committees on subordinate legislation as microcosms of the parliament, and we have checked to see how many regulations issued by arm's length regulators have in fact been scrutinized by parliamentary committees. We find that the Rajya Sabha Committee on Subordinate Legislation has scrutinized 4 regulations issued by arm's length bodies over a span of 23 years. Just to give you more context, just one regulator, which is the Securities and Exchange Board of India, the SEBI, has issued around 650 plus regulations over the same time span. So this is just to speak to the lack of scrutiny by representatives, state representatives over matters that touch, their lives and livelihoods, even at a decentralized level. Next slide, please. Now, the regulation of digital markets has also been a theme in our work program. It's a new and complex area of regulatory specialization, and it has been an emerging interest for us in the initiative. It calls for new thinking around what and how to regulate when we speak about digital economies. This paper by Archana examines the suitability of India's competition landscape to regulate its digital economy. She also evaluates the preparedness of the Competition Commission of India, which is the omnibus regulator of competition in the country, to investigate algorithms. She recommends a comprehensive antitrust strategy to address algorithmic harms. Next slide, please. In yet another piece of research on a similar theme, we have analyzed the internal design and governance arrangements in India's future data protection regulator. This regulator has changed, form several times over the past, couple of years. We have studied every single known form of this agency, and we have also compared and contrasted it with the design of, a few other select other Indian regulators. We have focused on 3 specific features across the board. One is the constitution of the regulatory board. The second is the constitution of the selection committee that appoints the board. And the third is the regulation-making process and the standards to be followed when making regulations as provided in all laws that have been part of this study. Yeah, this is the last slide, sorry. So this was just an attempt to give you a snapshot of the work that we have undertaken in the past year especially. But yes, I think now we can, since Dr. Sahoo's theme for this keynote was looking back to look forward, we thought that it would be nice to just go through some of the work we have done on agencies. Yeah. Also, before that, if you don't mind, we can launch the handbook before you get into the keynotes. So this is just a short handbook with contributions from the core team, that started the KYR series. So please feel free to look at it on the CPR website.
Before we turn to Dr. Sahoo, I'll just put in a special word of thanks also to CPR Comms.
Yeah.
Partly, I think they have, our communications team makes these digital launches of digital working papers and handbooks possible. But also this particular series really did take a lot of, involvement and engagement from them, because we taped all the conversations, some of them on site at different regulatory offices where they had to go and work on actually making sure everything was in place for those conversations. And then ensuring that each KYR session had a full video, which was edited along with all the briefing notes, which is what makes, I think, for a really nice multimedia resource with, these conversations featured. So they went well out of their comfort zone and their usual miking zones and really made this happen. So for the design of this handbook and for everything else associated with the KYR series, it's good to thank them as well at this moment. So thank you so much. And I'll turn to Dr. Sahoo now, who set us off on this and has followed our work to give us his keynote.
Will work. Thank you, thank you. So I was just thanking the CPR and all those associated with this KYR series for giving me a ticket to the KYR final. And though it's not comparable like a World Cup cricket ticket, still something important. So the establishment of the SRAs, independent regulators, I think constitutes the most significant governance reforms in the last century. And if someone is keeping track of the number of regulatory agencies that have come up, I have seen some database, somebody has kept track of the regulators that have come up in 45 countries. But we find that most of them, maybe 80% of them have come up in the decade from 1990 to 2010. Maybe India started a little late. But globally, that is the time that the new agencies have come up. And given the increasing role of the regulators in governance, they are now referred generally as a regulatory state. There are significant advantages of governance to a regulator. There are significant concerns too. The challenge is to minimize the concerns while harnessing the advantages. As I see from the KYR handbook, the KYR series has generated quite a few powerful ideas that can minimize such concerns and can help us to optimize the advantages from them. I would, for want of time, maybe I'll deal with one or two such ideas, but the appreciation of those ideas requires me first to dwell on the topic assigned to me, that is looking back to look forward. So I will look back a few times in the next 10-15 minutes to my familiar ground, competition, insolvency, and securities, to find out some examples. So let me start with something about the basic structure of a regulator. You would have noticed that there has been a sort of a crisis recently in the Competition Commission of India, because it is not having the requisite quorum of 3 members since October 2022 to take a view on combination notices, and consequently such notices have been piling up. But they have resolved this by resorting to doctrine of necessity, and they resolved in February 23, time being the problem is addressed. And when a regular member, when 3rd member is appointed, this should be resolved. But that is not a sustainable solution, that requires structural remedies. First, the law in our system, all the statutes that have created regulator, except for exception of SEBI or so, they have created boards governed by a board, authority by an authority, a council by a council, and by a commission by a commission. For example, the SEBI Act 1992 has established a board by the name Securities and Exchange Board of India, and the General Superintendent's direction and management of this board has been given to a board of members. So in simple words, the former board is a body corporate, while the latter is its governing body. Most statutes do not distinguish between these two. That is one of the problems of the competition law, leading to the kind of problem we had, because it does not distinguish between the CCI as an entity having an office, employees, assets, other resources as an organization, and the commissioner member having the responsibility to steer the organization. So consequently, CCI cannot transact any business if the commission does not have a quorum. This is the first issue. The second issue is that the Act envisages that every decision to be taken by the organization shall be taken by the commission in a meeting. And this actually severely limits the capacity of the CCI to that of the commission only. And as we have all known, a regulator performs typically 3 kinds of functions: quasi-legislative, executive, and quasi-judicial. Most statutes provide that the governing board alone shall do quasi-legislative work, drive the organization, and they provide that the quasi-judicial things are done by a system by a whole-time member or by a disciplinary committee, but generally the bulk of the work of an organization relate to executive or administrative work, which are delegated to different levels in the organization, and the CCI Act does not have that provision to delegate these functions to the various functionaries. And if you have the facility to delegate, that really expands the organizational capacity to ensure the timely service delivery. So therefore, looking forward is that the law must view CCI as a body corporate and the commission as a governing body of members separately with clear roles and responsibilities attached to each of them. And the commission should make the bylaws delegating its executive and administrative functions to a functionary, could be a chairman, could be members, could be a senior officer, secretary. So this would expand the capacity of the CCI manifold, and we would not have this kind of a logjam. So this is failure to distinguish between the commission and the CCI. There is also a failure to distinguish between the management and governance of the regulatory bodies. So typically, we expect that when we have a company, we expect company as an organization is driven by a board of directors. And it is difficult for an organization to take decisions about itself with objectivity or hold itself accountable for its performance. That's why decisions about the organization are typically taken by the governing body, by the governance arrangement, not by the management, those who are internal to the organization. Because conceptually, the governing body's role is to act as a principal to hold the management accountable. But it will be hard for a governing body to hold the management accountable if it has only members. So the governing body of CCI has only internal members who are full-time employees. They sit on the board, but all of them are internal to the organization. They do not have any kind of external interface. Many of the regulatory bodies have, many also do not have, but the law should require a formal interface between the regulator and the society in the regulator's governance. There are quite a few options, but the option that has been chosen most is the presence of part-time members in the governing boards. And many regulators have this provision, many have some governing bodies, some external committees, but most effective is that you have someone who sits, who has the power to vote, who has skin in the game, while he is not beholden to the interest of the management. So that is, in fact, this is another way also having the eminent citizens on the governing board as a part-time member, that also strengthens the democratic legitimacy and accountability. So these part-time members on governing board is something roughly analogous to the independent directors on corporate boards, though it is much more important kind of a conflict of interest a regulator has, or it's much more complicated. So therefore, the international best practice in governance is that for effective accountability, there must at least be equal number of independent directors as a number of management directors. So therefore, the number of part-time members should exceed or at least be equal to the number of whole-time members and chairmen in a regulatory body. And most of the regulatory bodies, we have one or two, maybe theoretically one or two external, but all of them are some way associated with the government or some organization represented by them. So this is the second one. We have to segregate governance from management. Third is relating to, which flows from here, about the other members, actually whom we expect. We think that there's a lot of discussion in the KYR series about the independence of the regulators. In fact, this is, we quite often we look at this independence as something, independence of a government. Normally people think that when we talk about it's misunderstood as independence from government, because in any case, it is an agent of the government. It is have a contractual relationship, a statutory contract. Government has the ultimate power to give directions to regulators, and legislature and judiciary by law have the power to scrutinize whatever the regulator do. So Actually, there is no point in talking about independence of regulators from the government, but sometimes we link it because generally there is some issues arise in the relationship between the executive and regulator. And most often this arises because the secretary of the administrative ministry is generally junior in the hierarchy to the chairman of the regulatory body. So chairman of the regulatory body feels, I being a senior, the secretary or joint secretary should not be doing or asking me so many things. This is one. Other problem arises because the government has a nominee on the governing board, and that nominee generally has a little more importance or influence than other members, and particularly when government has to pursue some other objective, sometimes it is in the business also, it has a tendency to push something. But if you have the powers to give directions, there is no need to have this kind of nominee. And by experience, I've seen not only government nominee, wherever, say in the SEBI board, I have seen the nominees of RBI, nominees of MCA, and even other boards I have seen, wherever we have nominees, these nominees generally do not take much interest on the other matters, but they take too much interest on the matters which have some bearing on their organization's work. So probably it would be better that if I'm talking about independence concept, these bodies may not have any representation of any sectoral interest, not espousing the cause of any organization or represents. You have the eminent citizens completely having no interest who can really hold the management accountable. But independence actually matters. It relates to the terms of the appointment of the regulators. The current arrangement of a 3 years stroke 5 years with the provision up to 65 years has ensured that we get people generally at a 60 and having not much interest to learn the complicated market things. And even those who make sincere effort and learn, they devote time, 3 years, by that time they do it and they are out. We do not get, let's say, promising advocate to High Court or Supreme Court by promising him that you come here for 3 years or 5 years. No promising guy would close down his profession or business for a job of 3 years to 5 years kinds of things. So if you link it 3, 5 years and 65, you want, I'm not actually talking much about the remunerations, many people talk about that, but this kind of system ensures that you really do not have a much capacity to withstand the pressures of the regulatory capture. Actual independence relates to that, how independent you are of the market. And if you can't withstand the pressures of the market because you are not well equipped, that is where actually we are compromising the independence. So that's why I discount much about the relationship with the government or government's intervention, because we know practically many things. Say SEBI has to issue a regulation, carry out an investigation, issue a direction, pass an enforcement, I mean, all these things. SEBI does it without recourse to government. So practically on operational matters, on specific transactions, giving a registration, giving an approval, there is no requirement of any way of getting the consent of the government, the legislature or judiciary. There are committees like subordinate legislation, they examine, may not examine, but practically in their operations, we do not, there is not much fetters on their independence, except that only with this one they can address, they can get the people with the right quality who are willing to learn, stay there long, and then able to withstand the pressures of a regulatory capture. Simultaneously, yes, there is need for also improving the capacity, the item, I think the reform idea 4, that talks about, I think this is yours, is that specialized and relevant training to regulatory officials along with the chairman and members or internal full-time members and chairperson. We need also capacity with the organization as a whole. There we need training. In fact, because sometimes we believe that or at least there is some regulators have come to believe that we need regulations every time the market fails, or even when the state fails also, we need regulation, regardless of whether it resulted from misconduct of a firm or there is inadequate supervision. And typical regulatory response is that add a new set of regulations. And such regulations may not have been necessary at the first stage. And even if you do it, if these are not designed properly, there would be ways to get around it, and then you will have a newer regulations. So as a result, there's a proliferation of regulations. Ill-designed, unnecessary regulations keep on increasing. And we are familiar with something called Maslow's hammer. That is, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. A person with only a hammer is likely to fix everything using a hammer without considering the other options. So as I just mentioned, it is in the time of a regulatory state, there is a regulation to fix every market issue, real, illusory, or hypothetical. And this has created a thriving industry of regulations. And this has now led the business to believe that on the one hand, government is doing reforms to give more freedom to people. On the other hand, regulations are taking away those freedom. And if you have noticed in this year's budget speech, the finance minister is advising that the financial sector regulator, they shall have public consultation to ensure optimum regulation, to reduce the cost of compliance and review all the existing regulations, para 99 and para 100, talk in so many words, realizing the problem that has come. But this public consultation will be effective if the regulator is able to demonstrate why it needs to have the proposed regulation. That means it needs to ask a certain questions to itself, like that, is there a evidence or a strong likelihood of any market failure warranting a regulation? Can any regulation address it, or there are better non-regulatory options also? Is the choice of a regulation better than other regulatory options? Do the benefits from regulations exceed the associated costs? Can the regulations be implemented and not subverted? Does the regulations have any unintended consequences? This exercise, which answers these questions in common parlance, is known as regulatory impact assessment. This provides the justification for regulation to be introduced, to be modified, to be repealed. And I know ABHA had done a recently program on regulatory impact assessment for the officers of a Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. It's a hugely successful program, I would say. But there is a lot of hesitance among the regulators. There have been several expert committees recommending that India should go for this. I'm not quoting, including the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission. But it has not taken up in India, perhaps for three reasons, as I see that. One is the non-availability of requisite data, but which is not an unsurmountable difficulty, because we get a lot of data as a byproduct of our operations. If you systematically start thinking and organize, you will have the data. The second is the limited capacity of the regulators to undertake RIA. That also is not insurmountable. If you have few programs like this ABHA did, with a few examples, I think the capacity can be built up. It won't be that difficult. But the real issue is the hesitance to be accountable. So if you can resolve this issue, probably we can, and if we can address these capacity issues of the organization through regulatory impact assessment and several other actions which a regulator typically takes, in the disposal of a so-called notice, how an investigation has to carry out. Unfortunately, we have so many courses, but we do not have a course on how to conduct an economic investigation or how to dispose of a so-called notice in a market environment or regulatory. All the regulatory operations, we really do not have any course, and academics have not yet come up with a course for these purposes. So if you can build the capacity of the organization through the techniques like RIA and have the people with reasonably good tenure of the members, probably you would have the real independence from the regulatory capture, which is really a material from my perspective. Usually, the sound regulatory system should avoid any kind of a regulatory overlap and gaps. But we have problems. You will find a maze of regulators 10, 20, 30 in one space, and there are a vacuum, and we have seen the problems. But I would like to highlight one kind of a regulatory vacuum in the sense that market, I'm giving an example from insolvency, but its problem is everywhere else also. So in insolvency, market would work if every market participant, at least all the players, all of them play by the rule book and they're subject to regulatory discipline with quick consequences for the contraventions. So that means all those who are participating, there is some rule to rein in, to ensure that they behave in a disciplined manner. Corporate insolvency proceeding is a team effort, it's a kind of orchestra, where the company, its management, creditors, financial, operational, the committee of creditors, the resolution applicants, they take commercial decisions in sync with one another. So if one does not perform, so then the chain can't move actually. So if one does not perform, the entire process is frustrated, the timelines are gone. But we have witnessed that several proceedings are getting prolonged, mostly on account of a variety of contraventions by these market players. Since the players are not within the regulatory domain of anybody, not IBBI, not even anybody, IBBI in the absence of this has a tried options, like it asks the insolvency professional, please behave in this manner, ensure that committee of creditors also behave in this manner, but that does not go very far. And I will give a parallel. In the early 90s, when SEBI was set up, SEBI did not have any jurisdiction over companies. Whatever SEBI wanted to do, it directed the brokers, the merchant bankers, particularly the merchant bankers bring the public issue to market. So it was saying that the company should behave this way, companies should disclose all the things, and these are your responsibility to ensure it. As a consequence, the broker, merchant banker, other intermediaries, they could not really do what the regulator was wanting in the interest of investor protection. And then we had in the 90s several fly-by-night operators we had from 93 to 95 or 6. But then the realization came that until you get hold of the real culprit who is doing the mismanagement, the company, the interested party, extremely powerful, you can't really regulate the securities market. But there were issues that company is a matter under company law. How can this be regulated by SEBI? So compromise was worked out, reasonable compromise that only in respect of issue or trading of securities, SEBI will have jurisdiction in respect of the listed companies. And practically from 96, we do not have a single instance of a fly-by-night operators. So like at the SEBI time, there was a jurisdictional issue, whether company affairs, SEBI or somebody else. Similar issues going on about insolvency with the creditors who are taking the most, they are the lead actors in insolvency drama. They are taking the decisions, who would regulate them, or if they do not behave well, who will penalize them. And it goes to the IBBI, RBI. And since they have not been able to decide who should do this, this remains unregulated. And I'm not getting into whether RBI, so these are the, of the financial creditors, maybe 10, 20, 50 or 100 are the people who are regulated by RBI, but there are thousands of people who are not regulated by RBI. And there are several issues to sort out that who should regulate the creditor, debtor, resolution applicant. But until you sort them out, you can't expect insolvency law to give the output as you expect. And you can't achieve things only by harping on the insolvency professional. The last thing I want to talk about is the timelines. Insolvency law is a timeline, and recently you would have seen that the competition amendment bill that was approved day for yesterday by the Lok Sabha, that says that has many new provisions, many modern provisions. One provision is deemed approval. It says that if the Competition Commission of India does not take a call on a combination notice within 21 days, it shall be deemed to have been approved. The market can go ahead with the transaction, and consequently the economy may suffer, benefit, whatever. But the onus is on Competition Commission that it must deliver on time. Similarly, a bill is going on in Parliament, is the Electricity Amendment Bill. That says that the Electricity Regulatory Commission, they have 90 days to clear application, to give a registration. And this bill is saying that if the commission, the Electricity Regulatory Commission does not grant license or reject the application within the time, it shall be deemed to have been approved. So there are several such things. We have tried many things, including in insolvency, that there is that in case of resolution of financial service providers, there is no objection required from the RBI. If a resolution applicant, incoming resolution applicant, RBI should give no objection in terms that whether that guy is eligible to take over this company. And RBI has 45 days time. If RBI does not give no objection in 45 days time, it will be deemed to have been approved. So when these are the kinds of things getting done in terms of deemed approval, why can't all regulators for every activity of theirs, and this is completely within their domain, they don't need any approval from the government, and they have full independence to do the things. For each activity, why can't they have a timeline? Application has come, approval has to be given by X days, registration will be given by X days, investigation started, enforcement show cause notice has been issued. All these have to happen in a time-bound manner. So I think beyond this, I would only touch upon that reform idea one, that is introduce a uniform code on administrative procedures. Of course, I have many things to talk on other ideas also, but this I just want, this is the most important, in fact, right? Because I gave you the examples of CCI, insolvency, and RBM and SEBI. We find that these are under three corporate affairs and economic affairs, Minister of Finance. So every administrative ministry is experimenting with a different model. Everyone has an argument that my sector is unique and I will have a unique way of structuring the regulator. So everybody experiments in terms of organization, structure, and matters to be regulated, the manner of regulations, and of course the new statutes, like the one instance has been given in the handbook. In IPSCA Act, there's a requirement that there would be a performance review of the IPSCA. There is a requirement in, say, insolvency law that there has to be a regulation to govern the process of making regulations. And many regulators like a TRI, ERA, they have perfected some of the arts of making regulations. But yet, there's a wide disparity among the regulators. So regulators' basic design, functions, powers, independence, accountability mechanism, all these must be similar. There should be a common template that can be developed covering critical overarching principles as a charter to guide the establishment as well as operations of a regulator, irrespective of their sphere of operations. This charter is something like the Companies Act. Companies Act is one act that governs all 15 lakh companies, and irrespective of the sector of a business. But one standard pattern is there. We have one constitution that applies to all ministries of the government. So similarly, you can have one pattern, and we have the examples like the Administrative Procedures Act 1946 of Government of the United States, the executive agencies, a guide for departments of Cabinet Office of a United Kingdom 2018. So every statute, I think, can have two parts. Part one provides the charter, because this is only about the regulatory design and the architecture part. Part two will have deal with the substantive matter for, let's say, securities, then security market related things, say unfair trade practice or trading, those details, if have to find place in the statute, can be in a part B. Part A will be uniform for everyone, and part one should provide a legal framework to enable the regulator to enforce its authority proactively, promptly, appropriate level of independence, matching the resources and powers, so that it is matches to the tasks it has been given, institutional mechanism to ensure its accountability, and also avoids the possible failure of abuse of power. Internal architecture, we have all talked about how the three wings, three state failures Dr. Krishnan mentioned about, the three wings, legislative, executive, and judicial, all three housed together. How do you organizationally house them that there's no intra-institutional bargaining or institutional bias shifting in from one wing to another wing. So those kinds of design, and because of the regulatory overlap and howsoever efforts you may make, there will still remain some overlap and some gaps. So that would require effective partnership among the government and the regulators to work in unison, and institutional arrangement to review the performance of regulators, and spacing of regulators besides the government and other regulators to avoid any kind of regulatory gaps and overlaps. So this is all I wanted to talk on this occasion. Thank you, CPR, for giving me this opportunity.
So thank you so much, Dr. Sahoo. That was, incredible set of comments. I think similar to when we started the series, just setting us off and now bringing us together. And thank you so much for your very detailed engagement with the recommendations as well. We'll now turn to Professor Devesh Kapur for your comments and reflections on the keynote as well as on the KYR series.
Thank you, Mekhala. It's a real pleasure to be at an event at CPR. It's an organization which for the past half century has contributed so much to our thinking. And it has an attribute which is rare in India. It has integrity. And just for the record, I just want to say that all of its well-wishers are deeply saddened and disheartened by the manner in which it is being treated by the government. I wonder if in a country where independent thinking is under question, can you really have an independent regulator? Because an independent regulator also requires independent thinking. Having said that, I have to say I have learned always so much from Dr. Krishnan and Mr. Sahoo on these matters. So I'll be just raising some questions and my own sort of modest observations. So one is on the design aspects of sort of regulators, is why is it that the point that Mr. Sahoo put it so well, that having a broad set of principles in a common administrative design across regulators, why was that not done? I think there's been an awareness of this for a while. Anyone who works in this area knows how these models have been done with the US in particular, and also the UK. Now, one sort of possible explanation is that the field of administrative law in India has always been very weak, compared to, say, constitutional law, etc., etc. And Dr. Raisa Vakil's work in this area really sort of highlights that. But the second, and as I've tried to follow this field, something I've been working on over the past 60 years, which is, there's a real parallel between how the bureaucracy, its engagement with state-owned enterprises, which was especially the case in the first 40, 50 years, and in the more recent years, the bureaucracy's engagement with the regulators. And the real regulatory capture, I would argue, is by the IAS. I mean, the civil service, I think, played a not very happy role vis-a-vis state-owned enterprises. The degree of control, insisting that the IAS could run, a sort of BHEL or, every commercial enterprise. And it took a long time after many, many mistakes that gradually we saw an improvement, especially after the 90s. And to some extent, I think the same thing happened here. I mean, the regulatory design had many features, but one of them was to give a parachute to retiring IAS officers. And that so much shaped its initial thing that, that also I think was a reason why neither the PMO nor the cabinet secretariat really came out with an overarching, sort of design for all regulators, so that there was a common framework sort of underlying them all, and there was a common set of administrative law that could be applicable. Now, even now, I don't see that a strong impetus for all the very logical and sensible ideas that Dr. Sahoo sort of put forward. Maybe I'm unaware of it, but this sort of ad hoc thing that each regulator sort of brings to its design has been a sort of broader weakness to the regulatory system as a whole. Now, I think when we think of the supply side, I think I always think of the demand side. Who really wants a strong regulator? Does anyone really want a strong regulator? I mean, if you ask about it, maybe this is part of the design. We want a strong regulator so we don't get massive mishaps, because that's a real political hot potato. But we want it not strong enough that there is not, shall we say, some interstices where people who have, shall we say, certain powers can exercise those powers with some discretion. So I think in some ways, the regulatory design is actually, it reflects those interests where a strong regulator is not something in high demand until there's a crisis. So to give you an example, the Drug Regulatory Authority. Now, what's interesting is, as I'm sure we all are aware, the failure of the Drug Regulatory Authority, that Indian drugs and Indian pharmaceuticals, it's one of India's more successful sectors. The lack of regulation has led to the death of children in Gambia, in Central Asia, and it's frankly, it's just manslaughter. And any other country, we would have seen very strong criminal cases being launched against these pharmaceutical companies. But above all, also from the regulators themselves, what were they doing? And I think we can well imagine why the regulators perhaps were not regulating well. And this is a case where now that people have died, you see a backlash, an international backlash, which is affecting India's pharma sector as a whole. Now you see a sort of flurry of activities by the regulator, right? So what you see is that the demand side of regulation grows after a crisis. This is why SEBI's powers grew after those repeated sort of market failures of the fly-by-night sort of corporate launches that led to huge sort of backlash. You see a sort of strong regulator, well, maybe strong, emerging in real estate, because there's a middle class. The middle class housing really matters. They've been gypped multiple times by like developers, and the middle class has voice and it's expressed its dissatisfaction. That has led to the political powers trying to come up with at least some regulation. But on the other hand, if you look at environmental regulation, right, that's been much weaker. The regulator has not been able to do much. And I think this is especially the case about regulators that are at the state level and not at the national level. I think one regulator that was mentioned in this report, which is the Maharashtra Water sort of regulator. Actually, it so happened that prior to reading this report, I'd been looking at that regulator in a very different context. Maharashtra, as some of you know, 40% of India's dams have been constructed in one state, which is Maharashtra. And the extraordinary amount of looting of money that has gone in building these dams is really, it's Maharashtra makes on dam buildings, makes Bihar look completely, pristine. It's that amount over decades, right? You have a regulator. I believe this regulator was set up in 2005. All you have to do is to read the CAG reports about the increase in costs and times of some of these dams. The costs and increases are not by a factor of 2, not by a factor of 10. In some dams, they're by a factor of 100. It takes quite a lot of skill to increase a project cost 100-fold, from where you started. But you have this regulator, and obviously its hands are tied. We see it doing some small things, but the really, really big things, which is extraordinary looting of state resources, there's very little action. There's, there isn't a strong thing. The key people affected are, of course, farmers, for whom all this is being done. But again, we see, it's much harder to organize farmers on things they didn't get, as opposed to withdrawing things that they did get, as we saw with the farmer protests. And I think whether it is the electricity regulator in states, whether it's the environmental regulator, I think some of the problems that Mr. Sahoo highlighted are actually much more acute in the case of regulators at the state level. Another thing which might be worth sort of thinking about is under what conditions could we anchor our regulation in international systems. So one thing which I learned from Dr. Krishnan was when he was part of the India's joining the Financial Action Task Force, right? That was a whole range of regulatory processes had to be changed, and they had to be changed to accommodate international standards. And by accommodating to international standards, India's own regulatory standards were upgraded. Two other examples, if you look at, again, going back to drug regulation, the drugs that are exported to the US FDA regulates those factories very, very closely. It inspects them. And if you talk to people in the industry, it's pretty clear that many pharma firms have two lines. One line's to produce for the US and for European markets, because regulation is very strong. And so the quality is much higher. And then the other is for markets for exports to Africa and for Indians, where the standards are much lower. Now, why we've allowed this, I mean, this is not, of course, official, I believe, but it's pretty clear that the stronger the external regulator, the higher the quality. Now, there are a range of things, especially in finance. For instance, the Basel regulations on bank capital, all of these are coming from international standards. And one of the things which I'd like to ask Mr. Sahoo and Dr. Krishnan is, when is it we should anchor our standards to international standards and use that to upgrade our regulatory systems? And when is it we should not? Another one which is very interesting is aviation standards. So, the DGCA was doing such a poor job that India was under threat of being blacklisted by the International Civil Aviation Organization and the FAA in the US. That forced India to upgrade its own regulatory standards and to upgrade safety standards in civil aviation. But when it comes to accounting standards, there are international accounting standards. but I understand, and maybe the Dr. Krishnan knows this more, that we have not really fully accepted some of the international accounting standards. Perhaps we are in transition. And I'd like to really hear whether we can use international standards in some cases, and if so, what are the principles we should think to upgrading our own regulatory standards. The last, which is a point, and then I'll stop, which is, I think, especially when it comes to state capacity issue and the capacity of regulators, we know that two things are just fundamental, right? But one is money, the other is people. Now, without that, whatever the design, it'll be ineffective. Now, I think what's interesting is that I think all these bodies, and whether you look at state-owned enterprises or any part of public institutions, without some degree of financial autonomy, it is very difficult to have functional autonomy. Now, some regulators have much greater degree of financial autonomy than others because of the way they charge for their services. So it's automatic, but many others don't. And it'd be nice to hear from Mr. Sahoo and Dr. Krishnan, why did this happen? And why was that not built sort of into the design? And the second is just personnel. I mean, one of the perennial challenges of the public sector, and by that I mean the public sector writ large, whether it is boards of public sector banks or the boards of public sector enterprises, or of course the regulators, is you have always a large number of vacancies at the top. Now, everyone knows, and these vacancies take enormous amounts of time to fulfill. And, often these regulatory agencies function much less because of these vacancies at the top. Now, my sense is over time, one is that you can look at these vacancies and say, well, that's just part of a, not very well functioning state. But my sense is that to some degree, the vacancies are deliberate. When I said that it is in whose interest to really have a strong regulator, and I think vacancies to some degree are a reflection that you do not want a strong regulator. You want to just keep it a little off balance. It functions, but you don't want it to function too well. Because if it functions too well, then some of your own interests get compromised. And, just having modest amount of resources, financial and human, for these regulators, which, by the way, can be sourced internationally. I mean, if you look at the Competition Commission of India, just having economists with really sound empirical IO, which is industrial organization, there are very few with such skills in India of international level quality, but there are many Indian economists around the world. There's no reason why the Indian state cannot tap them, but it will choose not to, right? And when you do not want to explicitly tap expertise which is available, it does raise questions about the demand side. And I'll end there. Who really wants a strong regulator? Thank you.
I think you started and ended with the same question, and really important question as to who really wants strong regulator. And I see just in the course of the discussion early on, Dr. Abha Yadav has joined us. I think Arkaja Singh, a colleague who has worked so much in this program, both of them we discussed at the beginning, are also here. So both of you would be great to also hear. Arkita, would you like to come up here so that we can just, so that, you know, as we have a few minutes for discussion, what we'd like to do is take some questions from those here in the room, but also I think on Zoom. So Veronica, if you could just open up the questions and I could take a look at them. And then also to Abha and Arkita, if you'd like to come in. I know, Arkita, I'm sure you'll have things to say about MWRRA and the role that it actually is trying to play and what that was about. And but it's an important question because I think your piece also addresses the sustainability and the point of, I think Dr. Sahoo also said, what can a regulator solve and what problems can a regulator not solve, which is a key kind of question. But there are a series of questions here from participants on Zoom. I will read out the first two, which is from Madan Vaishnava, and then I'll move to the one question by Dinesh Abrol. So thanks, Sahoo, sir, for touching upon IBC in, you know, your regulative talk. One more regulator is created, the Social Stock Exchange, very recently. When would we expect notification of the start of insolvency and cross-border insolvency? Still all work in progress. So there's a very specific question for you on an update.
Yeah, question is specific, very right, appropriate question, but it is an ask to the wrong person. Because I don't think anyone in this room is in a position to respond to when the personal insolvency, cross-border insolvency can start. And this is in fact beyond the domain of a regulator, because as I mentioned in my talk that center decides the policy matters, including center can give directions, policy matters to regulator. So for these statutes, provisions have been made in the statute, and it is for the government to decide when to start. Probably government has its own considerations. I have absolutely no idea. And as regards the stock, a social stock exchange, actually this is not that a new regulator is created. Stock exchanges used to have different platforms. Now they are adding a new platform for a category of companies for the specific needs of the investors in that area. So actually they are only replicating with some plus minus provisions what they are doing for normal companies. They will be using the same for this. Is not really a new regulator.
Thanks. Can you scroll
The
down?
second question is law related to combinations in itself is flawed. Discussion in 31 days going to make law even more problematic. I was involved in assessment of combinations in the domain of agribusiness. In fact, here I have a point that what Mr. Devesh Kapur was talking about, why not follow international standards? This is one something, a faulty international standard, and the international world is not willing to change it. The faulty I'm saying because, say in India, we have so far Competition Commission has handled about 1,000 competition notices. And they found, rightly or wrongly, competition concerns in less than 10 cases, less than 1% of the cases. And this is because they are looking at the combination as the control over two companies. That is not material from competition perspective. That is material for investor perspective. That is the lookout of the securities regulator. What is material for combination competition is that control over markets. And in fact, the Competition Commission found control of markets in 10 cases. So the rest 990 cases, those businesses we just came on their way, business in the, we rather created, instead of ease of doing business, we created difficulty in doing business. So this is something in international, this is emanated from the European Union, but they are reluctant to change. So quite often when you have a regulation, everyone gets so accustomed that they do not want to change. Regulation, in fact, works as a barrier to change. This is one example which India should not be copying from the West. And there are instances like the depository system when India did, there is no model to copy. India let down the model. So sometimes in insolvency, we have gone ahead on many matters what the world has. But there are also situations which are unique to India, like we have famous 29A insolvency where That's because we have promoters. That concept does not exist elsewhere. Yes, international standards should be followed to the extent applicable with modification to our context, but international standards are becoming quite conservative. They are not changing with the times. That is my concern.
I'm not sure if, Dinesh Abrol has anything to add, but I think that's a similar point in the last line, which is saying that undue faith in international standards is also not a valid way of moving forward. And I think that your point is well taken in that, we have to understand where it works. And I think his point about big business not wanting a strong regulator. So those are some of the comments that have come in so far. If there are any comments here, otherwise, so to turn to Abha and Arpita, if you wanted to react to what you've heard, but also to point out certain, particular things from the work. Yes, Abha, please.
We can get an observation in case there are no questions here. We can come back to some of the Devesh.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Sahoo. And I'm sorry I missed the earlier talk, but and
You missed a lot of thanks.
Yeah. A lot of them directed to you, so what of you?
Both of you.
No, thank you. And Mr. Kapur also, I mean, we've always been, a fan of your work, and I'm glad that, so my only two bits that I have to add after so much has been said is that I'm glad that, we are finally at a forum where we are discussing multiplicity of issues, because when we started, when FOIR came into IICA, the academic part of the Forum of Indian Regulators, and we started working. And then we, of course, reached out to CPR for the Know Your Regulator series. And Dr. Sahoo, I think at that particular time, sir, was chairperson of IBBI as well as FOIR. So many questions out of the academic deliberations came out. And I mean, it's a whole docket of, the way forward and so much more that can be done. And like sir said, we did a capacity building for TRI officials. And this was on regulatory impact assessment. And we realized that, TRI being, if I may say so, one of the most efficient regulators and forward looking, and, they already have an RIA in place, they do it. But the fact remains that standardization, as Dr. Kapur mentioned, amongst all the regulators, I think it's high time that some sort of standardization happens. There should be cross-learning, which is why bodies like FOR, FOIR, platforms such as here and at the Center for Regulatory Studies at National Law University, Delhi, maybe IICA, very, very important platforms. Because I think this is the time when we have to start with, also I think there are other people who will be talking and answering to Professor Kapur's question about, do we really need a strong regulator, and who wants a strong regulator? So I think this is the right time for introspection, especially looking at how the CCI is also, the Google order, and how internationally regulators are being watched. So that's my two bit for now, but of course, there's so much more to talk about. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Mekhala, and thanks. I also missed the first part of this discussion, but whatever I heard sounded fantastic. So there are, two or three. I mean, there's some distinctions that I'm not responding particularly to the question you made, but I think it might be useful to think of this as at more than one level. So there is the policy problem that a regulatory agency is supposed to solve, the policy problem of that sector in a wider context, and perhaps of the economy in relation to that sector in a wider context. And then there are obviously particular governance problems of that sector, the administrative problems of that sector. And the third dimension of regulatory effectiveness is, does the regulatory agency itself succeed or fail as a public institution, which are, sometimes questions at different registers and different levels, because, as you, quite, accurately pointed out, sometimes the regulator is a response to a very limited part of the problem, and it's not big enough as a policy response, but we are then talking about its failure in relation to a larger policy problem, for which so like those things get sometimes those things get mixed up, and those are different types of problems that each of these needs a considered response and much more work. And then I think lastly I'd come to this point about regulators and administrative law, because in which I think maybe there is a more general administrative law problem, but I take a slightly contrary view on the public administration, the Administrative Procedures Code point, which is just specifically to say that we don't have enough evidence of, for example, how many regulatory orders are struck down on judicial review for what kinds of administrative problems. There is, as institutions of public, as public institutions, as institutions of public administration, they are bound by some uniform cluster of administrative law and administrative principles of how administrative power are to be exercised. And in principle, when they contravene those, when they contravene that, that sort of cluster of, administrative norms, those things should be challenged in judicial review. We don't even know like how many of these are substantial. I mean, just in terms of the evidence, building up the evidence towards towards unified administrative procedure, we don't know enough yet. And this is something actually we talked about, maybe doing in the future. I don't know if we will now, but about actually looking at that evidence. Some of that evidence is sectoral. There's a commonality across regulatory institutions, and then quite a lot of it is sectoral, and quite a lot of it is more highly developed in the places where those regulatory institutions have a wider remit, like for example, the electricity sector, where they've been, functioning, where there's quite a long track record as well. So some of this is, much more developed in those domains than it might be in other domains. But actually looking at this evidence as, to identify where the problems are, not enough has been done over there. We have some, we have ideas that come from the practitioners, and I think those are very valuable ideas, experience that comes from the practitioners, but it would be, fantastic to see how that could be kind of measured against the evidence.
Great. Thank you so much. I think there's one other question from the audience, and I don't see any here, and there's also one from Yamini. So the question here says, the weakening of regulators by the executive may be related to the needs of the development state, which wants better cohesion of the state and a unidirectional push. Do you agree? So this is the reason for why, regulators might be weakened by the executive. And I think that would be great to hear, I think, both your views on. And then Yamini, if you want to add your question, then maybe both Dr. Sahoo and Dr. Krishnan would like to respond.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been such a fascinating discussion. And as I was listening to both Dr. Sahoo and to Devesh's response, and the sort of last question about strong regulator, it made me think a little bit about whether we actually want to place this, more frontally place the conversation of regulatory institutions within the framework of the broader discourse that exists already on state capacity when we talk about bureaucratic structures and bureaucratic behavior. And perhaps building on, one of Arkaja's comments that was highlighted also by Amrita, that, in a sense, the regulatory institutions have created perverse sets of incentives for bureaucrats as they seek to find homes there. But it's also brought to the fore bureaucratic forms of state operation. So, the point that Dr. Sahoo made, which really struck me, that, where we see failure, the response to failure is more regulation. That is a foundationally bureaucratic architectural challenge in how the Indian bureaucracy operates, and perhaps bureaucracies globally as well. And what strikes me as particularly challenging there is that the regulatory institution was meant to, respond to a very technocratic, specific sectoral issue. So, it needed to have a lot more understanding, say, of how financial markets operate and engagement with financial market actors. It needed to have much more understanding of the dynamics of water and water distribution, service delivery, as well as provisioning. So there's sort of the idea that the regulatory institution was meant to be insulated from the state, and goes back to something Dr. Sahoo said, and in that process also be insulated from the core functions of government. So it's not necessarily held to the same principles of accountability that government functions do, essentially has in a way prevented the regulatory institution from being embedded in the policy sector in which it is supposed to perform that function. And so it continues to do the default option of more regulation to solve a different type of problem. So I guess I don't so much have a question as it all comes back to, are we really talking about strong regulatory institutions, or is it more about capable regulatory institutions and ones that have to manage this very complicated issue of integrity and independence while being embedded in a sector? So when the regulatory institution gets embedded in a sector by bringing in sector, I mean, think about SEBI and all the big questions that we've been asking about SEBI over the last 2 months in India. It has a lot to do with when you start getting vested interest, but that represent the sector that you are supposed to be regulating, coming in to form decision making, then independence and integrity start getting undermined. So how do you make that balance? Is a very unique challenge, which is perhaps different, but not in my mind completely separate from the broader challenge of accountability and state capacity that we engage with.
Thanks so much, Yamini. Just watching the time, I'll turn to Dr. Sahoo, Dr. Krishnan, if you'd like to come in, and then Devesh, if you want to weigh in on any of the discussions to final, and then I'll close. Dr. Sahoo?
I won't take much time. Why is the bureaucrats or bureaucratization of regulatory bodies? And so if the organization is led by bureaucrats for decades, and you would expect the same culture as they were accustomed to, they had lived in a world that respond, if there's a problem, respond by a regulation. They will keep on, they have done that throughout their life, and they will replicate, copy paste the same thing again here. And that sets the culture of the organization. So probably you have to look at the root of the problem. That is one, and strong and capable, these are not two different things actually. If you are capable, you are strong. So it is only one thing. That's why I was emphasizing on the capacity of the, in terms of RIA of the organization, and capacity of the leaders, chairman and whole-time member. So if you have that capacity, you are strong, and if you have that capacity, you can resist the capture or you can maintain the independence. And the other question which came from the audience is that that's slightly difficult to question, that weakening regulators, is it something? But that means you are presuming that regulators are being weakened, to which I don't agree. So therefore, the second part of the question does not arise for me.
Yeah, thank you. Even where we are in terms of time, I'll be sort of try and be very brief, but some very, very pertinent issues and observations, Devesh. Number one, this larger question of why did we not have a set of broad principles? You raised it in the context of the APA, the Administrative Process Act. Actually, if you see the history of evolution, this wasn't something which came as a result of a coherent plan. And I'll elaborate on it as we go along with some examples in the financial sector. In many ways, the first of these serious SRAs, namely SEBI, Act of 1992, which itself was in the making from 1988, because the first draft of the SEBI law was written in 88, and it cooked because Parliament, you remember those times, it wasn't easy to get a legislation through, etc., etc. But the thought behind SEBI, surprisingly, has just not been replicated in almost any other regulator in India. The original SEBI plus some of the amendments in the first 3-4 years actually created a truly autonomous regulator with the resource autonomy, the HR autonomy of a kind which is very, quote unquote, foreign to Indian bureaucracy's thinking, and which has subsequently been very foreign in regulators, including those created by them, to answer your question very sort of pithily, there is no coherent thinking on regulatory questions. And I think that says something about, is it in the UK, it's the Cabinet Office which thinks about these things. So actually, we don't have a mechanism inside the government of India which thinks about this. Maybe it should be the Ministry of Justice. And if you remember, one reason why the Supreme Court has been pushing for a long time on a similar related topic is, why don't you have a common set of procedures in terms of appointment process, terms and conditions, etc., for tribunals? Because if you have a tribunal for armed force recruitment / service conditions, and you have one for civil services, recruitment and service conditions, they should broadly be following. They are dealing with employee grievances, they are dealing with disciplinary issues, etc., etc. There should be one SOP which should be literally cut and paste. No, we will reinvent the wheel. One retirement age is 65, one retirement age is 62. For one qualification is XYZ, for another it's ABC. So whole completely idiosyncratic things on matters which should be common is something we see across the space. And I think one reason is it doesn't get housed in one place. And despite the Supreme Court trying this for the last 25 years, tribunals are still not housed in justice or law. They continue to be housed in different ministries and therefore follow different trajectories. Two, correct point about bureaucracy and its engagement with state-owned enterprises. In fact, I think, and this is something Sahoo and I have discussed often, in government, we've grown accustomed to a category called attached office, subordinate office. So we have some old paradigms with which we are familiar. Now, this statutorily independent regulator, who, even if that regulator is resourced by public exchequer, is expected to function very differently from quote unquote an SOE or an attached office or a subordinate office, is completely alien to the bureaucratic DNA even today. 25 years after creation of a regulator, you will hear about regulators being spoken about in almost the same breath as state-owned enterprise, attached office, subordinate office. As they say, they are under us. That's the usual sort of bureaucratic language. So it tells us something about how we still need to conquer, quote unquote, this thinking. On your point about the IAS, I'm tempted to quote, you remember, there is this famous Maria Puzo statement about every fortune conceals a crime. I can tell you, every regulator conceals an IAS officer who was about to retire. And when we meet one-on-one, we can list out the regulator and the person who crafted or designed it. But on the first issue of why not a broad set of principles, if you remember, SEBI was almost entirely the result of Harshad Mehta. The act had been lying around for 4 years. It's a very creative Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh who converted that into an opportunity. Using a bond market problem, they created a market for, a regulator for securities market, claiming they are solving the problem created by Harshad Mehta. It wasn't entirely incorrect, but it was very clever. It is done very well. Likewise, the Forwards Markets Commission, which had been almost defunct after its creation for about 40 years, 50 years, got revived, and derivatives got permitted in India as a result of the Ketan Parikh scam. Again, very creative work by Yashwant Sinha, taking one sentence out of one report and saying we need a framework for risk mitigation and so on. So a lot of these have actually been somewhat of not a knee-jerk, but a reaction to a problem, but somebody then thinking through using that opportunity to do some good. So therefore, there is no common thinking which cuts across. The point about international standards, I think, is broadly well taken, but I think there is a much larger underlying question now. And I think this is something we need to work on. And I've been talking to our sort of internal teams on this. Public goods have a spatial character. There are national public goods, there are international global public goods, there are regional, and there are local. I am now, beginning to sort of wonder, there is a spatial dimension to regulation now. And I know if you've seen recently, this brilliant article in The Economist, which talks about this concept of air sheds. Pollution in Delhi actually needs serious action now by Peshawar and Afghanistan. So that air shed, which is the regulatory jurisdiction, is across cities, across states, and now across nations. US, you will recall, has done this beautifully for vector control. Vector control jurisdictions in the US have nothing to do with municipalities, nothing to do with states. They are completely scientifically determined, and they've figured out a way to handle this. And I think increasingly in goods that have or services that have an international dimension, pharma is an excellent example. I know companies which have, exactly as you said, factories that are dedicated only for FDA approval. So if FDA approval were to become a global standard, maybe, and there is a case for it becoming a global standard because things are getting exported all over. Strangely, pharma manufacturing in India for exports is licensed by a state regulator, not even by the union regulator. So some fellow sitting in Nagaland, Meghalaya can actually approve medicines being sent potentially to the whole world. And nobody in Government of India, etc., has a say on this. There are huge design issues there. Your point on money, people, capacity, well taken. And I mentioned SEBI is an excellent example where resource autonomy, HR autonomy was written into the act. And there, similar provisions have been written into a few other acts, but the bureaucracy has very effectively killed them in practice. Whereas in the case of SEBI, it's interesting, and I think this is worth a detailed study to be done later. It's the same bureaucracy which ensured SEBI's autonomy was actually protected by and large. I mean, there were obviously individual incidents of trying to control, quote unquote, SEBI's activities, but the polity as well as the bureaucracy ensured that the SEBI resource and human autonomy, human operations autonomy continued. So something worth looking at. Last question, Santosh Vaidya's question on cohesion and unidirectional push. Santosh, I don't entirely agree, because if there is an activity on which there is a decision to do regulation, typically it will be for, let's say, consumer protection. If you take the financial markets, typically it's for consumer or investor protection. Now, it does not matter to me whether, as a consumer, I have been cheated by a public sector entity or a private sector entity. I am a consumer, I need consumer protection. So therefore, this neutrality of regulation is something which is inbuilt and inherent in these kinds of regulatory designs. If you are talking about cohesion and unidirectional push, it should be on developmental activities, not necessarily on the regulational side, whether it's pharma, whether it's LIC listing as distinct from some other company listing. I think the considerations here are the consumer, who is the ultimate sort of beneficiary of regulation. So I would not entirely agree with the way you formulated it. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. That was a lot, and I see Partho raising two fingers from the back.
Oh,
But
that's
let me get you a mic. Hold on 1 second. If you could pass this one down. Yeah.
So just a quick short question, especially now, I mean, this was absolutely fascinating. So since I've seen this start from my early days in IDFC, this is really quite a reprise of where things have moved. But so now that there is a very large number of regulators, and especially in the context of FOIA, what is this? So the other way of getting to a corpus of administrative law and structure that is commonly agreed is through case laws and across a number of regulators. So is there some kind of, what is the extent of coordination, conversation, discussion across different sectoral regulators, cross-sectorally, and definitely within Dexity also intra-sectorally across states. In pharma, perhaps again, another possibility of doing across states. We evolve this corpus rather than it be done through some kinds of structures. Is there any kind of movement in that direction that we are seeing? And if not, can we think of institutional interventions that might sort of help foster that kind of movement, if you think that is a useful way to go?
Thanks so much, Dr. Sahoo. And I think Arkita, I don't know whether you'd also like to answer this or I can just turn the mic.
Your last part is right that there is a huge scope for someone, particularly good academic institution, to do this work. Yeah, there is of the three kinds of, okay, before that, we have seen a specific provision in the competition law. Competition law says that if there is an issue which I am dealing can have a bearing in the security market, I should consult them. It also says that if a security regulator finds that there is an issue which can have bearing on this, it can consult this. Actually, in a sense, they are obliged to consult. Also, there is a provision that when government wishes that making a legislation or some policy, should consult Competition Commission of India if there is it has a competition angle or something anti-competitive, though not strictly illegal. But on practice, we find that despite these provisions, regulators do not talk to each other. Rather, they prefer to fight in courts, claiming that this is my area. And some matters have gone to Supreme Court also. So at the regulator level, there is no effort actually. But the three kinds of work they do, the legislative, executive, and judicial, I think you are talking about this some harmony in the judicial part, not the other two parts. Actually, the major part of a regulator, though they do this quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial, most of the work a regulator does is the executive work. So 80% of their workforce is engaged in the executive work, which is in a sense unique to that sector. There can still be some learning, but quite unique to that area.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sahoo. Devesh, I don't know if you'd like to come in with any final thoughts, and there's a lot that has been discussed, triggered by your comments. But anything, finally, and then if anybody else in the room.
Guru has to have the last word.
Yeah, that he's good. I'm
So-
good. Yeah, go ahead, please.
So just to clarify about the international part, see, there's a difference between how we think about international standards versus internationally based enforcement. And I think in terms of standards, obviously not all standards are germane or relevant or the right standards given our particular context. I was more, the thing that was striking about the drugs, the FDA, and about civil aviation was actually on the enforcement part. And the enforcement part is much more on tradable goods than on non-tradable goods, right? So environment, real estate, electricity, these are non-tradable goods. But civil aviation, international travel, and drugs are tradable goods. And I don't think I'm saying anything new by saying that our enforcement agencies, well, other than those that are used for political purposes, but otherwise for the regulator, there are often weaknesses. And to use international enforcement to supplement, not to substitute, but to supplement domestic weak enforcement may not be a bad idea, as long as it is done in very specific cases in specific times. Thanks.
Thank you. So I was going to say, I think the guru would probably agree that the student or the shishya can answer, end the event. But there's something really for which I'm just really very grateful that this is 7:30 nearly on a Friday. And it is in true CPR, but also in state capacity initiative form that we are having a technical, substantive, difficult, nerdy discussion into the evening. And I think that's actually one of the things that has made doing this program, the Know Your Regulator program, working with all of you on regulatory design and capacity, but also the larger initiatives spirit, which is one of constantly trying to engage with issues, which we, as you started off with saying, is so important to the public, but that have also become, that require a combination of, real public spiritedness and persistence, but also a lot of technical depth and knowledge and, demystification and understanding. So, it's really just to thank everybody here today and all of you who we worked together with to make the Know Your Regulator series, to Devesh for engaging with today's event, and hopefully we'll have a lot more to discuss with you on the series of papers. All of them will be they are on our website, but we will replug the entire regulatory series now so that hopefully a larger audience will engage with this material. We have over these, I think everybody's mentioned it, but worked with 10 different kinds of sectors, starting with food safety, real estate, electricity, pension funds, water, insurance, the state electricity regulators, and health. And we began and closed with Dr. Sahoo's great experience with insolvency, bankruptcy, as well as competition. So it's really been, very exciting for me personally. Actually, the year before we started, right? So from 2000 to 2020 to 21 was a big discussion on the farm laws. These, absolutely strange and volatile and highly controversial laws. And that was a completely different kind of discussion on regulation and on law. And for me, as someone who's actually worked on agricultural marketing law, which is in a domain very different from statutory regulatory authorities, I've learned an enormous amount looking at how does regulation actually work itself out. And I think you mentioned water, then exactly this question of what is a regulatory problem. And I remember during the farm law saying we have reduced agriculture to a legal problem. And agriculture is not a legal problem alone. And it's only so in parts. So for me, I've learned a huge amount seeing this. And I think we began with FSSAI. And I remember when the week that we were doing the FSSAI KYR, the first one, there was a lot of discussion about GM and what is the status of GM seed. Harish had, intervened and got asked questions on that, as well as junk food and large corporate manufacturers and FSSAI and the informal economy. And of course, yesterday, the news media was buzzing with Tamil Nadu and Karnataka getting really upset about FSSAI mandating that Tair and curd be renamed Dahi and causing a lot of problems with this question. But it just again reminds us that there is a very lively and contested regulatory domain. And you know, that we are involved in. It's an evolving sphere. I think this conversation has thrown up so much in the way of new research that needs to be done, whether we are looking at case laws, actually studying regulators in greater detail, looking at regulatory impact assessment. Arkita said with a little nervousness, I don't know if we will do it, but I'm going to say we should find ways to do it. And I think, you know, how we do it, we can all discuss, but I think it's a testament to the fact that we're all here this evening, that I think there's a great commitment to doing it, to keeping this work on regulation going, but also, you know, the spirit of engagement, which really centers the public, but also public institutions. So thank you so much to all of you. And yeah, we'll put this up on the web as well. And it's great to have had this wonderful finale to Know Your Regulator. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Devesh.
Thank you.